I'm Lucy Fisher, the Whitehall editor at the Financial Times and the host of the FT's Political Fix podcast. I'm also an associate fellow here at RUSI, so it's great to be chairing this event here today. Now, as many of you may know, the CGGI is published by the Chandler Institute of Governance, the international non-profit that's headquartered in Singapore. It's research that measures the capabilities and effectiveness of 113 countries around the world, representing more than 90% of the global population. The index is based on 35 key indicators and is designed as a tool to support governments assessing their relative capabilities, strengths, and opportunities for improvement. There are some particularly fascinating insights and trends that emerge from the 2024 index, and I feel that we're meeting today at a crucial moment in the wider global debate about government reform, public sector innovation, and the key capabilities for civil service leaders into the future. So there's a lot to discuss today, and we have a fantastic panel to lead that conversation.
We will be joined on stage shortly by the Right Honourable Julia Gillard, Chair of Wellcome, the global charitable foundation that supports science to solve urgent health challenges. Julia, of course, in one sense, needs no introduction as the former Prime Minister of Australia and someone who's credited with having transformed education and healthcare in the country during her time at the helm. Julia's also written books about women in leadership and a life in public service. Dame Margaret Hodge has been the Labour MP for Barking since 1994. She served in government, holding portfolios across education, work and pensions, business and culture. In 2010, Margaret became the first elected chair of the Public Accounts Committee, and at present she's chair of the all-party parliamentary group on anti-corruption and responsible tax, where she's been relentlessly campaigning against financial crime and dirty money. Kenneth Sim is the Managing Director of Strategy and Research at the Chandler Institute of Governance, so he's integral to the production of the CGGI that we're here today to discuss. Kenneth is an experienced public policy practitioner and a former Singapore Administrative Service officer. He's held appointments in varied portfolios, including industry development, education, and energy policy. He's also served as Special Assistant to the Deputy Prime Minister in Singapore. So we'll start now with a short video from the Chandler Institute of Governance, followed by a 15-minute presentation from Kenneth about the key findings from the 2024 Chandler Good Government Index. After that, we'll move on to a panel discussion chaired by me, and then I will throw open the floor to questions from you. So please get your thinking caps on. We will wrap up by 2 p.m. sharp, and then there will be an opportunity for those present to join a networking lunch.
Now, more than ever, the world needs good government. For centuries and across cultures, good governance has been the foundation of peaceful and prosperous nations. When governments are principled and effective, they earn the trust of citizens and businesses, and attract talent, capital, and investors from around the world. With so many political systems and cultures, how can we measure good government in a fair, neutral, and relevant way? The Chandler Good Government Index is the world's most comprehensive annual index measuring the quality of national governance. It ranks 113 countries from across the globe, more than 90% of the world's population. Designed by government practitioners for government practitioners, the CGGI continues to drive honest and practical conversations about why good government matters and how we can achieve it.
Good governance is not just about political ideology or a checklist of specific rules or functions. A good government is one that has sound and effective public sector capabilities and that uses these capabilities in a balanced and accountable way to achieve outcomes that people and businesses care about.
But what capabilities do governments need most to thrive in today's world? And how can they measure their performance and progress?
All governments, regardless of ideology, can agree on the importance of skilled and principled national leaders, a vibrant economy, and a unified population. To achieve this, governments need the capabilities to implement effective plans and policies, enforce laws, anticipate the future, combat corruption, foster economic growth, build international partnerships, and be responsible stewards of national resources.
The CGGI takes a data-driven, non-ideological and non-partisan approach. We measure the quality of national government using 35 indicators which draw on more than 50 data sources. These indicators are grouped into 6 pillars of capabilities such as strong institutions and robust laws and policies, and 1 pillar of outcomes such as health, education, safety, social mobility and pollution control, which are important to people around the world.
The CGGI website features a range of tools that can filter and analyze countries' results, benchmark performance relative to other countries and global averages, and track country scores over time. Here, you will find the annual index reports, which go deeper into the stories behind the scores, showcasing the experiences and insights of governance practitioners from around the world.
We invite you to explore the CGGI and hope it serves as a useful tool and guide to those in public service.
Well, good afternoon once again. Thank you everyone for joining us today at the 2024 Chandler Good Government Index or CGGI launch. In the next 10 to 15 minutes, I'll take you on a whirlwind tour of what the results say this year, and also peel away to the data and the insights and the stories that emerge from the data in the last 4 years. But first, a little bit about CIG. As Lucy mentioned, we are an international non-profit organization and we're headquartered in Singapore. We're founded on a simple but a very singular dream that good governments are essential for strong nations. Nations that are cleaner, that are safer, more equitable, and more prosperous. And so we work with governments all across the world to build capabilities, and we do it in many different ways, through training programs, through advisory projects where we help governments to build strong organizations and systems that are the lifeblood of policy design and implementation. We develop practitioner stories and knowledge to share, and we also develop tools that governments can use in their work. So the Chandler Good Government Index, or the CGGI, is one such tool. Since we were founded in 2019, we have expanded our footprint quite gradually, but all over the world. We started in Asia, in places like Vietnam, Philippines, and India, but we have since moved to different parts of Africa, including Kenya, Rwanda, Zambia, and Malawi. So I mentioned that CGGI works with governments to build capabilities. But what are these capabilities that matter, and how do we measure them? That is the central question that we seek to address with the CGGI. As you would have heard from the introductory video, the CGGI measures government's capabilities and effectiveness in 35 different indicators and grouped into 7 different pillars. The first 6 pillars look at government capabilities. And these are very bread and butter, but important things that all governments will need. How you implement policies, how you coordinate, and how do you deal with corruption. The last pillar, which we call helping people rise, looks at the outcomes that matters to citizens. So things like environmental sustainability, healthcare, and education. And we call this pillar the helping people rise pillar. On to the results for the CGGI 2024. Singapore is once again in the top position. It is the only non-European country in the top 10. Second place, we have Denmark, which has moved up 2 spots from 4th place in 2023 to 2nd spot in 2024. And in 3rd place, we have Finland, who has maintained its position. We had 9 new countries join the index this year. Luxembourg is one of them and has joined the index at a very credible 7th position. Moving on to the 11th to the 20th places. The UK places 11th this year, just slipping out of the top 10. It was 10 last year and 11 this year. The UAE has a very, very credible performance and improvements over the years. It has moved up 6 spots from 20 last year to 14 this year, and cementing its position in the top 20. The United States and Australia ties for the 15th spot. Both countries slip slightly in the rankings, but are still quite clearly and firmly in the top 20. Japan, for the first time, falls out of the top 20 to land at position 22 in this year's ranking. As you can see, the changes in the top 10 for the CGGI haven't moved very much. There are some movements up and down within the top 10, but by and large, it is the same. 8 out of the 10 top countries in 2023 continue to be in the top 10 this year. And this is, of course, intuitive, because capabilities take a long time to develop, and I hope a long time to erode. The biggest movers this year are also shown in this slide. Botswana has the honor of being the biggest mover this year in the correct direction. So it moved 12 spots up. It is now the second highest ranked African country from sub-Saharan Africa. The UAE, as I mentioned, has had very credible and steady performance, improvements in its performance over the years. It's moved up 6 spots, and Greece has moved up 4 spots. Now, in the opposite direction, we have also some countries that have fallen. Of note is Russia, which has fallen 12 places from last year. This could be partly due to the effects of the war. So let's move on beyond the top 20 to look at the broader stories and narrative that the data is telling us. I would like to start with a chart that I think shows very aptly why capabilities matter. Each dot on this map, on this chart, represents one country that is currently ranked on the CGGI. We have mapped the country's performance in the capabilities indicators on the x-axis, and map that against the indicators that look at outcomes, national outcomes, and this is on the vertical axis. And immediately you can tell there is a relationship between good and effective government capabilities and good national outcomes. We're not able from the data alone to establish causation, but it's intuitive that more capable governments can also deliver better outcomes. Now, another insight from this graph is not just about what the trend is, but who exactly represents each of these dots. Here, I've split the countries into 4 different categories. High-income countries represented by the dark blue dots, and the lower and middle-income countries represented by the light blue and the red dots. The immediate, point is that the richer countries, the wealthier countries occupy the top right-hand corner, which means they do better in capabilities and outcomes, and the lower middle income countries and the low income countries occupy the bottom left-hand corner. So one may think that wealthier countries can produce better outcomes and capabilities, and that is true, but maybe only to a certain extent. We have some important outliers in this chart, the dot in blue and the dot in red. Any guesses what these countries could be? No? Well, I think both countries are actually quite interesting. The blue dot is Vietnam. Vietnam is a very interesting story. When I first started showing this chart in 2021, it wasn't an outlier, but it's gradually moved from the bottom left-hand corner to the top right-hand corner. The other is Rwanda, and it's consistently been an outperformer with all the other peer countries in the low-income group. So this, to me, at least means that, I hope it means at least, that good government is not beyond the reach of any country, regardless of its wealth and its national circumstances. We have been publishing the CGGI since 2021, and we have had 4 years of data, just about enough for us to see some trends, interesting trends and insights over the years. Let us start by looking at how performance is unfolding at the regional level. In this chart, I've grouped the countries into 13 different regions, from Western Europe all the way to sub-Saharan Africa at the bottom. Now, there are a few very interesting insights. First, is that regional performance seems to fall into 4 very distinct and separate bands. We have band 1 at the top, comprising Western Europe, Northern Europe, North America, Australia, and New Zealand. And you can see there's a very, very large gap between that band and the next band. The second insight is that except for one notable exception, there is no convergence over these bands in all 4 years. And the third, and perhaps the most worrying for us, is that the gap is widening. So if you notice at the bottom, we have Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia that is declining. So this means over time, the governance gap has been widening. I mentioned earlier there is one notable exception. That notable exception is East Asia. There are 4 countries in this category. There's China, there's Mongolia, there is South Korea, and Japan. Now, there are a few interesting insights from the East Asia performance. The first is that the performance has been consistently improving year on year. There is no dips down and dips up. It's consistently improving. Second, the performance improvement is also significant. It has the largest improvement in any other region, shown in the earlier chart, and is rapidly closing the gap between band 1 at the top. The improvements in East Asia is largely driven by 2 countries, China and Mongolia. South Korea has improved a little bit, not much, and Japan has maintained its position, maintained its score relatively, but it's dipped slightly in rank because others have come up on top of it. So those are the regional trends. Let us zoom into the trends at the country level. In this chart, what I have done is I've mapped the scores of countries in the 2021 index. I mapped that against the scores in the 2024 index. Countries above the line, represented by the dots in blue, have shown improvement over the same time period. The countries that are represented in the dots in red have had a decline in performance. Now, it is noteworthy that there are many, many more red dots than are blue dots. In fact, there are twice as many red dots than blue dots. What this, of course, suggests is that in general, if you look at the quality of governance across the world, there's actually a decline. But let's look beyond dots alone and look at which countries these actually are. In this chart, I have labeled the countries that are the top 10 improvers and the countries that are the top 10 decliners. And what do you notice? Almost all the countries that have improved the most are from the top half of the performance anyway. And almost all the countries that have declined the most are from the bottom half of the ranking tables. So put differently, what this means is that the best are getting better and the weakest are getting worse. And if you look at the analysis from a quartile by quartile, you see a similar pattern. On the fourth and the third quartile, the average performance of countries in both quartiles have actually declined by 4% in the fourth quartile and about 3% in the third quartile. For the first 2 quartiles, a slight dip in the first, but quite a reasonable improvement in the second. So I started my short whirlwind presentation by talking a little bit about, by looking at the results for the CGGI 2024. I explained that there were not very major shifts, but there were some movements in between. We looked at the relationship between national capabilities and government capabilities and national outcomes. And then we looked at some trends that have happened in the last 4 years at the regional level and at the country level. And the key insight, at least for me, is that the governance gap is widening. So I've spoken about the past. Let me pivot to the future, which incidentally is also the theme of today's discussion. In this year's index report, we investigate how good governments are also better prepared for future challenges and opportunities facing every country around the world. We found very, very strong correlations between the results of the CGGI and indices that look at the government's capability and ability to prepare for the future. Whether it's about creating the right conditions for peace, to attract, retain, and develop talent, to prepare countries for AI, or to adapt to environmental threats. So this suggests that good governments are also better able to adapt for the future. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Well, Kenneth, thank you for that fascinating presentation. And Margaret Hodge, Julia Gillard, thank you for joining us on stage. Let's start with a discussion on what a future-ready government would look like. I want to ask each of you, in your opinion, what are the core attributes or characteristics of a future-ready government? Julia, you first.
Well, I think the thing that's in shorter supply for political leaders today is time. And so I'd like to say time to think, but it's just time to do anything that they're short of. And so I think the thing that governments need to build within their political structures, their advisory structures, their intersections with the civil service, public service, and with instrumentalities and stakeholders beyond that, is time for deeper reflection and thinking. And it's so hard to slow it down in an age where everything is coming at you so quickly. So I think prioritising, insofar as you can, given the other pressures, that deep thinking time is truly important. And if governments had the ability to do that, then I think it would flow through many of the indicators and metrics that this work is measuring. You would be able to prioritise better, you'd be able to reflect on the nature of your institutions more deeply, you'd be able to think about future challenges, and the list goes on. But having been in that whirlwind, I don't underestimate how difficult it is to do that. It's easy to be on the outside and preach it, harder to be in the middle and do it. When I was there as Australian Prime Minister, I used to try and carve out time for that sort of deeper reflection. We referred to it as time in the cone of silence, which was not from the security agencies, but from Get Smart, for those of you who are old enough to remember the comedy show Get Smart, where they'd retire into the cone of silence, which never worked. But, you know, looking back on it now, we did not carve out enough of that time and that sort of quiet thinking space.
Fascinating. Margaret.
That's a very interesting perspective on it. I'm taking a slightly different view. I think it's, but you know, I think the two come together, so that works well. I think it's about being absolutely clear on your priorities. You know, government is complex, so you have got to choose where you're going to focus. And it took me time to understand that in my various roles as a minister in government. It was really my last job where I had 6 clear objectives that I wanted to achieve, and I never let go of those, and that enabled me actually to go further. So I think that's the first thing that I think is a clarity of purpose and a clear prioritisation. Then I do think leadership matters. I think leadership is absolutely central to good governance, and you see that across the world where you have the more capable, you know, actually collaborative, inclusive leadership, you probably get much, much better governance. So I think that is hugely important. I think flexibility matters, so that whilst you should have your clear objectives and you know, stunning leadership, you also need to be flexible so you do respond to the issues that emerge and you're not sort of rigid in your approach to it. And then the final thing, I think, really, from my experience of government, is you need to have incredibly good working relationships. And I would say that's with your civil service. It doesn't work. You know, I think we've witnessed that in the UK, the confrontation, over recent years, the confrontation between the civil service and the politicians is deeply destructive and leads to poorer governance. So that's got to be a good relationship. You've just got to work at it and make sure, you know, recognise each other's strengths and recognise each other's roles. But it goes beyond that, because government nowadays is limited in our reach. So I would say it's also got to be good relationship with other stakeholders, be it the private sector or be it civil society or whoever else. So I think those are the 4 things I would do. But time, when you talked about time, I remember being in one job, which was, I was the first children's minister actually in the UK. And one day my diary secretary we had a chart every day about the meetings. I had 16 meetings that day. It was crazy. And prioritizing, it meant that you don't achieve very much. And actually prioritizing, determining, and giving yourself time to think is central.
Kenneth.
Hello. Yeah, so I'm going to take a slightly different slant to it. Going back to, I guess, the tagline, trust in governance. It's something that I've been tracking for a long time. It is a very slow but pernicious trend that has been happening, and that's a decline in the trust in governments. There are many indicators that look at that, many surveys, but they all point to one thing: it's either declining or just not doing so great. So one example is I was reading a report from Pew. They track American trust in governments in America. It used to be 80% of people would think that they trust in government in the 60s during Kennedy and Eisenhower's time. It is now about 20. Right? And a similar pattern shows up in many different indicators and surveys out there. So I guess for me, a future-ready government is one where trust in governments and governance is restored and it grows. I think this is important because a lot of research goes out there that says compliance to policies and ability for the government to execute policies is related to trust. Yeah, so that to me is my hope for future-ready government.
Julia, recently you've talked about the importance of harnessing artificial intelligence for the public good. We all know that it's an emerging force that has the ability potentially to improve lives and livelihoods, but also to disrupt inequitably. How can governments better prepare for emerging technologies like AI and ensure that the opportunities are seized but the risks are mitigated?
I actually think this is a project that goes beyond national boundaries and therefore goes beyond the remit of nation states. It's something that ultimately, like climate change and other global challenges, is going to require international cooperation. So I think governments need to play a role in driving that. And someone needs to be the one that initiates the diplomatic dialogue that starts everybody thinking about the intergovernmental arrangements, the diplomatic arrangements, the architecture that's needed. So I'm not saying that good government doesn't mean you're thinking about AI, you're waiting for someone else in the global community to do it. You have to be driving it. But I think when we're trying to conceptualise what regulation might look like, what AI for the public good might look like, it is beyond the remit of one national government. Oh, sorry, I'm getting run a different microphone. Hopefully that makes a difference. And just to give an example from the Wellcome World and science, a number of years ago when there was the original ability to start mapping human DNA, there was a debate about whether that would be done in the not-for-profit sector or whether that would be done commercially. And ultimately what happened was sections of DNA were mapped in various places around the world until we had the whole human code. And Wellcome Sanger here in the UK played a very disproportionate role in that. And that has therefore been available as a free scientific asset for researchers around the world and healthcare providers. We've had DeepMind release the AI-driven protein folding technology, and I won't trouble you with the details and I'd probably get them wrong anyway, but knowing how proteins are going to fold is very important to scientific research, hugely cumbersome to work it out without the benefit of AI. Now, DeepMind released that platform free of charge to the global community, and scientists are using it today. But there's no reason they did that other than out of the goodness of their heart. They could have made that proprietary technology and could have charged people to use it. And that's just an early example of the kinds of issues about public goods that AI is going to spin out and we're going to have to think about. And many of them to generate will be so resource intensive that no one government could fund them, let alone one government trying to regulate AI when it is inherently moving around the planet in a borderless way. So I think what we're going to need here is a global architecture that probably relies on an independent expert panel to try and sort the science and the perspectives and then bring it to the decision-making table, a bit like the manoeuvre that we've tried to do in climate change with science and the scientific panel bringing the updates around climate change to COPs and then nation states doing the negotiations. And one thing that really strikes me in AI is the gap between government's knowledge, politicians, civil servants, and the people who really, really know is, you know, it's an ocean. And whilst, you know, we've been in the heart of it, and you might get sworn in as Minister for Education and do the deep dive and, you know, learn things about education or healthcare or children's services, if you got appointed as Minister for AI tomorrow, I mean, you know, where would you even start if you didn't come from that deep background? And so I think building in that independent expertise is going to be hugely important. I just wanted to cycle back to the trust question, which I think you very perceptively raised. And one thing for us to interrogate about this database, which is so useful, is the gap between what it's telling us about government capability and what populations are thinking about government capability. And we can perhaps most finely grain that in the democracies that have got elections this year, because we're getting a lot of polling analysis come through. So that's true of the UK, true of the US, and true of many others. But, you know, I would bet if you went outside and found someone who's from the UK as opposed to a tourist and started interrogating them about where, if they had to guess, where do they think the UK is on a good government index, I think they'd say bottom 10. You know, a happier person who's enjoying the sunshine might say, oh, you know, in the middle. But I don't think anybody would volunteer the analysis, oh, really, really near the top, like in the top 20, definitely. And so interrogating, and in the US, I think you'd probably not only get that kind of answer, you'd be at risk of physical violence given the number of guns that are around for having asked the question. You know, I think interrogating why is there so much difference between public perceptions and what this index is telling us is a hugely central question.
Margaret, I see you wanted to come in on the AI question.
Oh, well, the only thing I wanted to say about AI is I'm completely ignorant on AI, which shakes the point that Julia makes, that between the decision makers and those with the knowledge. I have two things. My real fear with AI, I don't think it's quite like global warming, because global warming, there is a sort of common interest which binds us. And on AI, trying to get international agreement, there's more of a competitive and not common interest. And trying to get that, you will end up at sort of lowest common denominator, which may not be enough. That was my first observation on that. I mean, I would wish you were right, but I fear that it's going to be very, very difficult to get it. And the other thing is that when I talk to my colleagues, particularly my Labour Party colleagues who are all now preparing for government, in the hope that we are given that confidence that we form the government, and AI is pretty central to their considerations. I keep saying to them, it's a tool. It isn't an end in itself. And, you know, there is a danger that you look at these advances in technology as being solutions, and they only have to be a tool which fit into a strategy, not a strategy within themselves. That would be my only two observations. I've got lots to say about the perceptions, but we'll come back to that.
Yeah, we will come back to that. Kenneth, there was lots of interesting insights that you picked out from the index data and results. East Asia is firmly on the up, driven by China and Mongolia. Japan's fallen out of the top 20. What sort of surprised or struck you most about it? You're very in the weeds of what it's found.
Yeah, I've been struggling with this data for the last 1 year, trying to, and I think the one thing that really struck me was the extent to which there was a governance gap. Yeah, I knew there's going to be a bifurcation somewhat, but I didn't realize it was that great. But I guess on hindsight, maybe I should have, because we were already looking at a few countries, and there were only a few countries that was on a positive trajectory. Vietnam, the UAE, and a few others. And I don't know. My guess is that maybe some of these things have a self-fulfilling prophecy and a certain momentum. When you build, you go up, and then when you start, declining a little bit, and then it starts going down. Maybe, I don't know. So I think to me, that was the biggest and most interesting insight. Yeah.
Julia, what grabbed your attention?
Well, I'm very, very thankful that Australia and New Zealand got their own region. Thank you for doing that. That made me sort of proud when it came up, and I saw it in the report looking at it earlier. I agree that the pathways, I mean, the fact that you've done this work now is starting to give us, over a number of years, is starting to give us trend lines. I mean, this would be the first time that you could reliably say that we're getting a trend line. And the trend line clearly is not one to be happy about. And, if we imagine where will this work be in 10 years' time, I think we could easily see just a continued uplift at the top, a degradation at the bottom, and the gap in between being so huge. And when you look at the countries that are at the bottom, we are talking about major countries, big populations, important to geopolitics. Nigeria is one, Pakistan is one. I mean, this is truly concerning that we can see the downward trend line in countries of that size and heft. And so that made me reflect, on part of the work that I've done post-politics as being in the overseas development aid community, where we spend a lot of time thinking about institution building, capacity building, good governance. And when you look at this material at the index, it does kind of smack you in the face that we have to think very, very carefully about how effective or ineffective that work is being in some very important parts of the world.
Margaret?
I think these are incredibly difficult endeavours to undertake. And there are a number of sort of different indices that we look at. And I have to say, it's really going back to Julia's point about perceptions and what the index says. And I was sort of struck by some things which just felt to me not right. So I'm digging down a bit, just let's be clear what you're doing here. Only less than 40% of the data that is analysed is quantitative data, and the rest is normative. And I think there's a judgment in there, and that I think we've just got to reflect carefully on that, because some of the final judgments you then come to don't seem to me to fit in with my perceptions and judgments on the nature of governance in certain jurisdictions. So I was sort of slightly, and the criteria you choose are also, I mean, for me, it's the work I do. My work is very much focused at the moment around corruption, illicit wealth, and tax avoidance and evasion. So in that sort of world, when I see China on the rise, I think, really? And it's sort of, I slightly hold back on it. And again, in that sort of world, when I see Luxembourg coming in as 7th, I just again think, what on earth are we measuring here? But it may be something about internal governments, but it also may be it's the impact they're having on the governance of other nations, which we ought to sort of reflect on quite carefully, because, there's a lot of tax avoidance and evasion takes place in a tax haven like Luxembourg, which I don't rate, so I don't value it. So I just think. My final thought, it's something which I said at the beginning. When we think about good governance today, we've got to think in a very different way than when we thought a generation ago. A generation ago, in my youth, you would look at the nature of the politicians, the civil service, and the public sector organisations and how they were functioning. Today, government is just less important in the governance of a nation. It's just got a lesser role because of global companies, because of global events, warming and all that sort of stuff. And I think if you want to look at governance, you have to take a much, much wider role. I mean, you know, the Googles of this world, et cetera, have a greater impact on governance than they would have had a century ago. So looking at governance, I would just want to go a bit further. So I applaud your attempts here. It left me with a and when we come to Britain, having been here in the UK for the last 14 years and seen the decline in what I consider good standards of governance in all sorts of ways, I was amazed we were still in the top 20. But, you know, there again, relatively, maybe we will be, maybe we should be. But so there are, you know, I would sort of say it's a good attempt, but you're in very difficult terrain, and there are some surprises there which I think come back to reflect a little bit more on how you judge, what you judge, and the way in which you do it.
Kenneth, I'm sure you want to come back on some of that.
No, fantastic, fantastic. And actually, I would hope that people who read our index will also look at it with a healthy dose of skepticism. I want to say at the start that we are limited by data, right? If you want to cover 100 over countries, then there's only that amount of granularity you can have. Unfortunately, many of the data sources are survey sources. But the second and more important is exactly what you said. We hope that this tool can be used as an initial start for countries to have a sort of internal self-assessment and engagement within themselves about whether they agree. If you agree that you're top, in your case, you don't agree that the UK is as highly ranked as it is, then why, you know? And so I think that's how we would like the tool to be used. The China point is an interesting one. I don't know what people in this room feel, but just to say that the index is non-ideological and is non-partisan and is regardless of political systems. So we just ask the questions, is good coordination in government, for example, important? And if so, whether you are a democratic system or non-democratic system, you should also have it. And maybe the final point is that, and here I'm not defending the index at all, but I'm using the same metrics that says the Nordic countries are doing really well. And these same metrics are also saying XYZ countries are improving. But maybe just going back to the China thing, I completely agree with you. I think that this tool should be used as an initial conversation starter and a tool for self-reflection.
Kenneth, something you alluded to and that struck me was how the gap between better performing states and weaker states is widening. So I wanted to ask each of you, what can governments and those of us who work in and around government do about this worrying trend? Julia.
I think it comes back to the point I made before. It does require us to have some deep reflection around the capacity building overseas development aid agenda, the work that's been done, and clearly isn't showing positive pathways in this work. And of course, this work is not the only way of measuring that, and not all overseas development aid work is in governance and capacity building. You've got the humanitarian programs, you've got the service outreach programs. I myself was very exposed to the work in education. But it is a section of the work, and we need to be thinking that through. I also think it does require us to be interrogating a series of things about how this index relates to other global measures, to see if we can bring out trend lines. I know when you did your opening remarks, you said you can show correlations but not causations, and that's to be expected. But I would be interested in deepening the correlations, at least, as a spark to further discussion, because I think that would help us pull out some threads on this growing gap. So if we did, for example, look at this data alongside measurements of how nations are going on the Sustainable Development Goals. I think if we looked at this data alongside the World Economic Forum Gender Equality Index, you might well pull some themes that are very interesting. Almost any of the global indices that you look at including the Gender Equality Index. We'll have the Scandinavian, Nordic countries at the top. As a former education minister that used to live with the national debate that came out of the international testing every year, the 15-year-old international testing, where the Finns always came first, inevitably provoking a national debate about why isn't our education system as good as Finland's. So you'd be muttering to yourself as education minister, damn those Finns. Even though those debates can be very uncomfortable, you've got to be sophisticated about them. Finland's population size, homogeneity, a whole lot of things mean it's not a great comparator for many other parts of the world, but it does enrich the public conversation about what should we be focusing on. So I'd love to see the sort of broadening to help us pass out what is driving the bifurcation.
Margaret?
Again, I'm completely with Julia on all her contributions. I think, interesting enough, I'm going to, it's about immigration. So there's been we're all resisting the massive migration from these states. They turn out to be the ones, many of them with very low governance, on your index, with very low governance scores, to here. And we hate it. We're all resenting it. We're all trying to pull up the drawbridge. And yet we don't do the thing that we ought to do, which is actually support and invest in those countries, so that their people feel nobody chooses to leave their community and their family and their friends and their environment. They leave it because of fear of oppression, or fear of poverty, or fear of global warming, or whatever it is. So if we could simply be more outward looking rather than inward looking, and see our role as supporting and investing without being sort of a moral imperialist about it, which is a difficult thing to do, then I think you might start closing the gap. And that is partly about supporting changes, constitutional and structural changes, but it's also part of aid, where we have been absolutely terrible here in the UK in cutting our international aid budget. And then the other thing, which is this a sort of reflection on the index, the importance of ethical standards, which you've got in there. You have got it in there, but I would sort of heighten it. I think it's such a key indicator, and sort of the corruption and good standards, of public life, importance of good standards of public life. If that somehow can be more of a shared agenda, and one that we talk to people about, I think that again would stop me. But I was going to say, just on education, remember Korea was always held up, particularly in the global world, as one, certainly in maths education, they were always top. I haven't looked at those tables recently because I've been out of that field, but they always used to top the tables in early days. So you'd look beyond Finland into Korea and think, blimey, what are they getting right as well? And it was interesting. We don't always get it right. We also have to learn from developing nations which may have less sophisticated governance structures, but succeed in other ways in terms of outcomes for their population.
I'm interested in what you say about upstream spending in some of these weaker states in the West, and I don't know if people in the audience later might want to pick up on how governments can make that argument to populations who feel that it's not a good use of taxpayers' money. Yes, the argument perhaps has to be made. Kenneth, the Chandler Institute of Governance supports governments in capability building. In your experience of working with governments around the world, what would you say are the common opportunities and challenges in this regard?
Yeah, well, I'm going to answer your question, but I just wanted to very quickly respond to something that Margaret said earlier about drawing links between the CGGI and governance. We actually called it the Good Government Index. Yeah, for a very deliberate purpose, because we were afraid, or part of the reason, is that if you call it governance, then it's harder to define. It's just so broad. And we get into questions about political ideology and political systems, which are important because they represent values, but we wanted to focus on more practical conversations about capabilities, which is why we call it the Government Index. Okay, but sorry, your question. CIG works in largely Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. So these are developing countries. In my conversations with government leaders, both politicians as well as public servants, two things always come up. The first is that I have no resources. I cannot spend any more cent, a single cent more, because my fiscal envelope is so tight. And so the first thing they will usually do is to cut funding for government capability development. The first thing that usually goes is the National School of Government or the Civil Service College. Sounds familiar? So that's the one insight that I hear. Now the second comment, and this goes back to your point about the relationship between civil servants and politicians. The second challenge is one of mutual recriminations. The politicians will say, hey, you know, I really have this really great idea, but the civil servants are kind of lethargic, and you know, they're not following my agenda. Now, on the opposite side, the civil servants will say, hey, you know, I really want to do this, but I have no political cover, I have no political support, and in fact, they cut my funding for training and capability development. So I don't know where the truth is, probably somewhere in between, but I think those are the challenges. I don't have a good answer to this. If I did, I'll be a very wealthy man. But I think, Julia, you raised a point earlier about finding specific interventions and measuring them and seeing whether they're impactful. I personally feel that it is a no-loss approach to build a strong core, C-O-R-P-S, not C-O-R-E, a strong core of public servants that, you know, speak the same language of public service and can coordinate across the public service. And the reason why I say this is because, and here I'm speaking as a former public servant, right, is that the civil service is only as strong as its weakest link. So I think having that strong core that's united in purpose and mission across the civil service is really important. And how you do it, it's not very innovative, but it works. You know, you bring them you give them joint projects, you set up a systematic way to develop them at junior level, mid-career, at senior levels, but I think it works.
Well, we know 2024 is this major year of elections with a huge proportion of the world's population going to the polls. And this may mean we will see scores of countries entering transition in a period of change. However, there's also something to be said for continuity and longer-term planning. So, Margaret, to you first. From your experience in office, how could governments better balance political priorities, which tend to be shorter term, with this need for longer-term planning and preparing countries for the future?
I think I'd start by saying I think there's a false dichotomy. You've got to think, you know, if my party comes into government at the next election, will be imperative, those of you that are here, there will be imperative in those first 100 days to demonstrate real change. So the short term does matter, and you have to you know, get confidence, get the trust that you want, get a sense of direction and moving forwards and change, all those things. You've got to do that. If you do nothing, you know, if you're only looking longer term, it won't work. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing is that the legacy that we will have here will be an incredibly difficult one. You know, an economy that is sluggish, taxes that are higher than they've ever been, public services in absolute disarray, the impact of Brexit on growth, you know, and also maybe the legacy of the trust budget. So we've got a terrible, terrible legacy. So the first thing, I think the way I would do it would be to actually, I would love to see an audit of where we are straight away, so across all public services and the economy, So then you can have something against which you can measure the progress you make over time. I mean, God knows whether they're going to do this. I'm going to be out of it. But my recommendation to my colleagues who are going to take it forward would be to do something like that, so that that gives you a baseline. You know, you're not going to see your doctor within 2 weeks within a 2-year period. You're not going to see your doctor if you've got cancer, let's say. You're not going to have that first counselling within 2 weeks if it's day one. But if we can have a baseline of where we are, and then we can measure the progress that we take, I think that's really important. So I think that's another thing. And then the final thing is, for us, it goes back to this index. I think there is a complete loss of trust in the UK in politics and in governance and in government. And therefore, I would, at a very, very early stage, have an agenda about how we're going to clean up government and how we are going to govern in a way which is much more transparent, much more accountable, and ensure that those things that have gone wrong over the last 14 years don't actually inform the way that we work in the future. So I think there are things, you've got to build that hope. You've got to have a baseline from which you can then measure progress on your longer term priorities. And it's the things that I said at the beginning, you know, be absolutely clear about those priorities, be focused on what they're going to be. And then I think you just, the mechanisms of governing, governance protocols have got to be, how ministers behave, how MPs behave, how the civil service behaves, all that has got to be really important. And I just wanted one final reflection. When you think about the civil service, here, I'm talking the UK context, so apologies for those who are looking before that. We have such a mixed economy in the UK. Over half of our public services are now delivered by private and private sector institutions, and therefore the skills and the capability that we need within the civil service is completely different to that which existed a generation ago. Because a lot of it is about, it's not just developing policies, it's how you manage the delivery of services through such a fragmented state, which is what we're going to inherit. Think of trusts, think of academies, think of the privatization of the energy companies, all that. It's a very, very fragmented. So I think longer term, the skills that you evolve in your civil service and in your political class as to how you affect change in this very, very different framework, I think requires some thinking through and training of very, 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 very different skills than we might have had a generation ago.
Julia, reflecting on your time in office, what advice would you give to new governments, particularly for their first 6 months?
Certainly lay in a lot of coffee, you're going to need it. One thing, and it draws on themes that we've been talking about, but this theme of capability building, particularly for political parties that have been out of government for a long period of time. I mean, what is so truly terrifying about the first 100 days is that there aren't great systems of capability building for politicians and for special advisors. You would say special advisors here, we talk about political advisors in Australia. So, I mean, literally the experience is you're the new minister for X, here's your office, here's your civil service head, you're entitled to however many advisors and however many media people, here's the promises we made in the campaign, knock yourself out. That is literally it. The strongest survive, the weakest get cold in the first 12 months in normally bloody and very unpleasant public scandals, and the middle try and keep their heads down and hope no one notices that they're not excelling that well. I know that political parties in opposition these days are wise enough to know that's going to be a problem, and they start some capability building in opposition. but sustaining it in the white-hot spotlight of government, I think, is, to the best of my knowledge, a nut no one has really cracked around the world, and I think that requires some thought before you get there. And you can say, well, you know, you can always draw down on the resources of the leader's office and all of that kind of thing, but they're also under a lot of pressure and tension. And you do need some people who are just that little bit back from the day-to-day fray, who can keep, you know, being wise counsel, helping people diffuse problems that people think that they can go to without it necessarily putting a blot on their political copybook. So that kind of capability building is something that I would recommend putting in place even as you're rolling out your 100-day plan. And then there's the difficulty of bridging from what you've promised to the, you know, longer term rhythm of governing. I mean, in reality, political promises only come in, you know, three kinds of ways. You promise a thing, we'll train 100,000 more nurses. You promise a law or a regulation, we will, you know, outlaw X or facilitate Y. Or you promise a process. You know, in government, we will have a commission of inquiry into insert problem here. Then, you know, in government, you will obviously get the public service advice very quickly about how to deliver the thing. There are all sorts of support processes onto how to draft the legislation or the regulation. But you normally come out of an election campaign with multiple promises about commissions of inquiry, looking at things, and actually thoughtfully across government programming those so that they come up to their conclusion in a rational and digestible pattern. That is work, I think, that needs to be done in the first 100 days, but often gets ignored. And because you didn't get it right in the first 100 days, for the balance of your term, you end up with, you know, commissions of inquiry all reporting at the same time, all running over each other, not necessarily working in a way that means you can put them down like jigsaw puzzle pieces and click them together. And it's just, you know, creating landmines for you to trip over in the future. So even though it's not very interesting in many ways or as immediately gratifying as commencing the process for delivering a thing, you know, where as a politician you can go and stand by the new intake of nurses who are being trained, that's all good. All of this is a little bit behind the you know, not the shadows, but it's, you know, less reported, less in the public gaze, but it's incredibly important work. And then, but you referred before to agility. However well you've done your manifesto, however well you've thought about the policy issues in the run-in, you know, events, and how you build sort of robust systems within government so that you can recalibrate programs as needed because of economic, political, global events, is, you know, building in that resilience. It's partly about character and leadership, but it is also a lot about processes and how people know they will come together in what ways and formats to deal with necessary changes.
Of course.
What Julia said jolted my memory about 97 when Labour was last came into government. And we had I don't know who remembers it, we had 5 very simple pledges. We all carried them around on we had little cards with the pledges on them. And one of the things that I hope this incoming, the people who are, if they're privileged enough to get office, will be the incoming government are thinking about, is we knew that we cared about education, and we knew we cared about the health service, but it wasn't enough to say we will focus on education and health. We had to find specific pledges around them. And some of you may remember the pledge on education was to reduce class sizes in primary schools, and the pledge on health was to reduce waiting lists. And the moment we got in and started delivering on those, we realised we got them wrong. And it was really interesting because, of course, what we wanted to do was raise standards in education, and class sizes are not the key factor that will raise educational standards. And similarly, we wanted to improve health outcomes, but actually waiting lists weren't the key factor. The key factor would have been perhaps to reduce cancer waiting rates or something like that. And we just got them wrong, and it's a really interesting test, and I'm sure we will have that consumer offer this time round. I'm not involved in making it, but getting that right, because you are expected then to deliver on it, but getting it right in the context of your wider aspirations of what you want to deliver is a heck of a challenge.
Well, let's hear from you. Please feel free to say your name and affiliation if you wish. Yes, the gentleman here, please wait for the microphone.
Thank you very much. Very interesting panel discussion. I have two questions and an observation. My first question is, it's noteworthy that the best performers are mostly smaller and medium-sized companies. Is there something inherently more difficult about large countries achieving good government because of complexity? My second question is, where's Taiwan in the index? And my third question is, looking at, this is more of an observation, but I just happened to glance down and notice that the Russian Federation is ranked number 45 for helping people rise. Maybe I've been reading the wrong newspapers, but it makes me fear for the other 65 countries below them and their people.
Great. Julia, you first perhaps on the complexity of large countries.
I think population size, definitely makes things more complex. Intergovernmental systems, Canada, Australia, many other nations in the index, the United States, have got shared power between national and regional governments, and that can have its strengths, but it also adds complexity to major reform agendas. Population size is not the only form of complexity. I think the nature of your geography, natural assets, all of those things feed into it. The nature of your population too, how homogeneous, how heterogeneous, how many people are recently arrived, the needs and capacities of people who are recently arrived. Are they coming under skilled migration schemes or through refugee and asylum seeker programs and may need additional forms of assistance? All of these things, I think, layer into complexity. Fragility in the face of climate change. Many small island states, etc., irrespective of the capacities of their government, have got this existential crisis looming. And so, all of these things feed in, and it would be, intellectually very challenging to try and build them somehow into the index. You'd really be, doing like a handicap race, wouldn't you? The people with more complex factors would get some sort of weighting. People with less complex factors would get a differential treatment. So you could really see, if you could hold all other things equal, who's doing better, but intellectually very hard to nut that through.
I mean, I think my only observation on it, Linda, because this is really for you, is it may be where it is, but I think in a bigger country, you've got more room for innovation. So again, it's what you're measuring, because you can do innovation at a sort of local, and it may well be that the more innovative, radical, future-looking countries are the ones where they're larger and you can have that bit of innovation. And I come back to my observation on Luxembourg. That might be number 7, but do I really rate it? No, I don't think so.
Kenneth, Taiwan and Russia.
Sure. So I think you asked about Russia and helping people rise. I don't have a technical answer to you because I don't have the exact data behind it. But I think maybe other than just looking at the data now, maybe we should look at the direction of travel to see where they have been moving up and down. But overall, I must say that Russia did not do too great this year. It really did not. And in fact, because it's a lag in the data, I suspect that in future years, some of the effects of things that are happening today may have an impact on the direction of travel for Russia in the next few years. Taiwan, I don't have data for them. Yeah, I don't have data for them. I don't have data for them to include Taiwan as a separate jurisdiction. Yeah.
Right. The gentleman here. Next. Sorry.
Thank you very much for a very interesting discussion. My name is John Barker. I'm the director of Cambridge Governance Labs. Up in Cambridge, we work actually quite closely with the Chandler Institute of Governance on a project promoting ethical governance in developing countries. And we're collaborating, and I commend them on this index. First point, in relation to the index itself, is that one of the more elusive indices is the ability of a country to extinguish the sparks of conflict as they arise, and promoting both dispute avoidance, dispute management, and dispute resolution, including remediation. This is often an invisible dynamic which is often overlooked and which requires the building up of local institutions, their capacity to use alternative dispute resolution mechanisms, mediation, and so on, not only in the formal legal sector, which is what we focus on, judges and courts and so on, but the informal sector. In, for example, in Africa, 90% of disputes are resolved outside the formal system. So it's an invitation and a challenge to try to promote remediation and capture that, because otherwise the sparks grow, they go underground, they reappear somewhere else, and you've lost opportunities. So that's just one area where I think additional work could be done. Thank you.
Who'd like to come in on that? Kenneth.
No, I was going to
No?
say.
Okay. Is anything, any reflections?
Well, it's also disputes between nations, not only within, is my only. I'm just thinking about, Gaza, and at the moment, one of the striking features of the failure to get a peace process is the absolutely anarchical leadership in all of the three component parts. So I think it's, I think if you're thinking about dispute resolution, I think obviously within countries, but it's really between countries, which worldwide we want to see, and that, I think, leadership is absolutely crucial.
Let's move on to fit in a few more questions. This gentleman here.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, really, I applaud the index. I think it's very useful tool to assess country performance. But your data is heavily biased by smaller countries, and you absolutely need to fix that. I mean, Luxembourg, 365,000 people. You're comparing with Germany with 80 million. So you've got a massive bias in your data, and you need to address that point. Otherwise, I mean, the top 10, I don't think there's a country, well, the top 7, there isn't a country with a population greater than 10 million. And that, it's quite difficult to compare very small countries with very large countries. So you need to adjust your statistics to cope with that problem. And it's a very noticeable distortion, and it does devalue the power of your index. I really applaud you for pulling this together, because, everybody likes to know how their country is performing relative to other countries. But if you've got that level of distortion, people are going to question the results. Thank you.
I'll take a few. The lady here, second row. You, yeah.
Thank you so much for speaking with us today. I'm a master's student at King's College, and my question is whether you think there are any potential harms for instituting a list like this one. Because when I first looked at the list and the criteria, it actually reminded me somewhat simplistically of the college rankings in the United States. And as a student who grew up in the United States, I looked at lists like that influenced my decision of where I wanted to apply based off of a somewhat selective and somewhat arbitrary list of criteria that was not holistic. And I was just wondering if you think there are any potential harms for individual people or states looking at a list like this and judging other governments and themselves off of what makes a government good or not good.
Thank you. We'll take just one final question. This back to the lady behind you.
Hi, my name's Alex. I'm from Kivu International. I spend a lot of my time working on a governance project in Malawi. So I was really interested in Julia's comments on how ODI can be used to improve governance in poorer countries, and also Kenneth's point around technical assistance. But I have noticed in my work that a big problem is often the policymakers, the politicians are not do not have motivation towards change and towards reducing corruption. So I'm interested in, maybe Margaret's got a take on this, but how the UK and other richer countries can use soft power and the IFIs to sort of fight corruption on that kind of global scale.
Great. Margaret, you first on that.
Well, I spend a lot of my time in post-public accounts committee talking to a lot of the Commonwealth countries about, to the politicians in the Commonwealth countries about accountability and taking anti-corruption measures. And I think the way you have to handle it, I mean, the way I tend to handle it is just, most politicians have a big ego. Of course we don't, do we? So if you can persuade them that actually if they were to use their authority to try and get the corruption out of their system, or draw it to accountability, or relate to it helps them to relate to their voters. That's the sort of line I take with them. They want to be popular with their voters. They want to get a load of media coverage. And if they are seen as being sort of advocates and leaders in trying to get a less corrupt administration, that sort of encourages them. But I mean, I always do that. You know, I see them for an hour and a half, and how you've then got to actually pursue that. And the other thing I have done in the past is, you know, I've built through women politicians who, you know, you try and build networks that you then sustain over time, which you can do on Zoom and so on. And that, I think, is really helpful. So you keep encouraging them then to develop new ways. But I'm very, very, very conscious, particularly after 14 years of, I don't think, good governance in the UK, that you don't want to be imperialist. You don't want to be a moral imperialist when you try and say everything we do is great, because it isn't. So we too have got to learn. So I think it's something about building, it's just showing them, demonstrating to them that actually there are other ways of succeeding rather than being part of a corrupt system. It's not a very brilliant answer, but I think it's about as far as I can go.
Julia.
Yeah, I'll pick up on the question about can this index or indeed other indexes do harm? And I think the intellectual answer to that has to be it's possible. And I know what you mean about blunt measurements. When I was Education Minister, did a very sophisticated public-facing measurement of the quality of schools, which eradicated the kind of league table fears people had, which only would have shone a spotlight on schools in disadvantaged areas in an unpleasant way. So getting the construction right and the narrative around what the index does and doesn't do, I think, is really important. Still possible for someone to pick it up and misinterpret it. I think the likelihood of that happening with this index is comparatively low, because it's going to be, it's a product, obviously aimed at people who are in the government governance, public policy world. It's not a consumer-facing mass product in that sense. It's not going to, go into the hands of citizens in a contested election campaign with false claims around what it may or may not mean for how people should vote. So I think the likelihood of this index, therefore, working some distortion is far less than a lot of consumer-facing kind of indexes. But it's never zero, and it's a good challenge, I think, as Chandler thinks about the future iterations of the report, how it can war game and think about potential misuse and guard against it. It's a really good challenge.
Kenneth, do you want to?
Thank you for the comment. And yes, Julia, I agree with you. So on our part, we have to be a bit more deliberate about how we communicate and how this index should be used. So I'll definitely take that point. And maybe a quick reply to the gentleman over there. I'm happy to have a discussion with you. If you have any thoughts, I'm happy to take it on board. Thank you. Yeah.
Great, let's fit in another couple of quick questions, so please keep them brief. This man here.
Hi, thank you. This is Jack Aldane for Global Government Forum. It's a quick question on AI. I think the UAE AI minister recently said that we should expect a lot more AI ministers going forward. But speaking to what you said, Ms. Gillard, about the daunting task that an AI minister faces on their first day, and what you said, Ms. Hodge, about a sense that, well, I think from your experience that we don't have very many qualified ministers to take on these challenges. They often come in with a classical education that it's assumed they can extrapolate to almost any subject under the sun. In your view, and how you would go about cleaning up government, and then your perspective too, how should we reform that particular problem within governments that I'm sure isn't exclusive to the UK, but other countries as well?
This gentleman here.
Hi there, my name is Conor Mokler. I'm a master's student at King's College London. My question is related to the role of an increasingly fractured media landscape and its impact on trust and governance in the 21st century. A lot of the successful large-scale government programs in the mid-20th century were in an environment of a dedicated mainstream media, newspapers, small number of TV shows, TV news networks. Obviously today that's very different. The rise of social media, online clickbait, disinformation, all of that. I'm sure, Lucy, you may have some thoughts on this also, but how can governments sort of control for this in terms of advancing a shared narrative in terms of putting their agenda forward?
We've got about 3 minutes, so Julia, which question would you like to take?
I'll take the social media question. I mean, I think we need a whole other forum and a whole other dedicated session on it. And even at the end of it, we wouldn't have the answers, because I don't think anybody has actually found the answer yet as to how you pursue deep, complex, long-term reform agendas in an environment of fractured attention, people's ability to apparently pick their own facts and their own truth. If you don't like these facts, you can always look online and find alternate ones. And with the capacity that all of that is going to get worse with AI, where you not only will have the fevered social media landscape we have now, but you will have fakery that even very informed, sophisticated users of media content will not necessarily be able to recognise as fake at the moment of use. I don't think anybody's got to the bottom of this yet. I think at least our problem definition is better than it used to be. We're more knowing now. I think the consumers of social media are also more knowing now. I think the movement to get people to, if not give up, at least wean themselves off intensive over social media usage there's a healthy kind of counter movement now. And I'm hoping that out of all of that, we might find some better pathways forward, but it is incredibly difficult at the moment. And we shouldn't romanticise the past. we're old enough to remember that past, you know, you could get very perverse outcomes with very entitled and empowered media moguls in thin markets, insert the word Australia in this sentence, deciding that they thought X or Y about who the government should be or what that government should do. And you would find mass distortions flowing from print assets that they owned to radio assets that they owned to magazine assets that they owned to nightly news services that they owned. That wasn't a happy world either. But at least you could see all the pieces all at once. You know, as a politician navigating it, you could see all the pieces and all the motivations. Now it's like looking down a kaleidoscope, and every time you look back, all of the pieces have changed. And there are too many of them for a human brain to possibly wrap their mind around. And so it is more complicated, but we shouldn't romanticise the past.
Well, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. So I'd just like to finish by saying a huge thank you to Julia Gillard, Margaret Hodge, and Kenneth Sims. Please join me in giving them a round of applause. Thank you.